It? Yeah. You better come with me.
Yes, boss.
Captain Mainwaring, leader of the Warmington-on-Sea Home Guard, is one of Britain's most famous comedy characters.
I am making notes, Captain.
Over the many years of Dad's army, viewers have taken this pompous, self-defeating, but funny little man to their hearts.
What you like, you're not going to win this war.
Oh, yes, we are.
Oh, no, you're not.
Oh, yes, we are.
Whistle while you work. Hitler is at work. He's half army, so's his army. Whistle while you...
Your name will also go on the list. What is it?
Don't tell him, Pike.
Pike.
The role could have led to even greater success, crowning Arthur Lowe's reputation as a great comedy actor. But by the time he died, he was back to the provincial theatres and lesser productions of his early career. What was behind this dramatic decline? Remarkably, it may have been the very person closest to him, his wife Joan.
It was a deep, deep love affair. He was totally and utterly in love with her, and everything was for Joan, really, quite honestly. She was his Fingali, really.
Their love was so intense that, in many ways, this was the destruction for both of them. Neither grew to their full potential because of each other. Their love was kind of like a destroying angel.
In April 1982, Arthur Lowe and his wife Joan Cooper were appearing in Birmingham in a touring production of the murder mystery Home at 7. Even at the age of 66, Arthur Lowe maintained a punishing work schedule. That day he'd appeared in the afternoon matinee, he'd done television and radio interviews, and was due to appear in the main evening performance. This despite worsening health.
His state of health was very poor at that time, and everybody knew it was. And he'd have lapses into sleepiness. He slept very badly at night. Yeah, his health had deteriorated a lot by then.
I think he should not have been working, actually. I remember at that time his ankles were swollen, various things, and I think he just wasn't very well. But Arthur was a workaholic. He wouldn't stop.
An hour before his curtain call, alone in his dressing room, Arthur collapsed. Arthur Lowe was born in 1915 in Hayfield, Derbyshire, the only child of Arthur and Mary Lowe. His father, Big Arthur, was a booking clerk at the local railway station. When Arthur was 1, the family moved to the back streets of Manchester, and little Arthur grew up in this red terraced world. He left school at 16 in the middle of the Great Depression and found work as a clerk in a bicycle store and later in an aeroplane factory.
Arthur's roots were in the Dark Peak, and Hayfield has its very own black satanic mill. And you are expected to go and work in the factory and to do that all your days.
Arthur Lowe might never have escaped the factories had it not been for the war. In 1939, 7 months before war was declared, 23-year-old Arthur joined the Duke of Lancaster's own yeomanry as a cavalry trooper.
I'm smiling about it now because I couldn't think of anybody more unlikely as a cavalryman than Arthur Lowe.
Always slightly bald and glasses on. He looked a bit older than us.
He wasn't athletic, was he?
Certainly not athletic.
He'd been attracted to the regiment because he fancied himself on a horse, but there wasn't much call for horsemanship in World War II, so he was redeployed.
With Arthur, he always seemed to get a soft job, if you like. Didn't he? He was in the stores.
That sort of job was an exalted job in the army. If you were in the quartermaster stores, you were someone to look up to.
Yeah. Well, it carried 2 stripes for a start.
Corporal Lowe turned out to be a natural mimic and performer.
He was always entertaining, taking off officers. He could take off officers, how they spoke and how they acted.
I will observe that I keep one foot on the ladder, here, and one hand on the post, here. The other foot is in the boat, thus.
Captain Mainwaring was him. I couldn't see anybody else doing it. It was that natural. The part was just made for him.
Bad eyesight meant Arthur was regraded and packed off to the Middle East. He was sent to the Sinai Desert, 1,000 miles from the front, to an ordnance depot where he maintained radar equipment.
I mean, looking back in hindsight, you could see Mainwaring all over the place, because that was him, you know. He could be very pompous at times, Arthur.
One of Arthur's duties as corporal was to take parade. Even though this was a specialist, non-combat unit miles from the front, Arthur insisted on doing everything by the book.
It went up on the notice board that, as from Monday, KD will be on, which was short Bombay bloomers, they called them, and it was flipping cold. We said, well, you know, we're not turning out in KD, because I'm afraid we weren't normal soldiers, if you put it that way. We were all technical people, you see. So on Monday morning, Arthur come marching on parade with the Bombay bloomers and the khaki shirt, and because he was only a little bloke, and he went potty. He really blew his top. And that was Arthur. I mean, that was typical.
There was no entertainment amidst the tents and sand dunes of the Sinai. To beat the boredom, Arthur Lowe formed a drama group, and before long made his stage debut.
It did. It went down a treat. I mean, now you can sit back and say, well, I knew he was going to be good, but you didn't know that. But he was good. I mean, he was very good at dialect, and you could tell he was a good actor.
Later on, some newspaper reporter said that he'd been at RADA, and during the war. And of course, what he'd been was a radar technician during the war. He'd never been anywhere near an acting school.
Arthur's acting education began with his transfer to the Field Entertainment Unit. He was posted to Alexandria to work with Captain Martin Benson, who'd been an actor before the war.
It was highly sophisticated. The ladies all were dressed up, and it was really like being at the Royal Garden Party. Imagine Glyndebourne, for example. It was rather like an Egyptian Glyndebourne.
Martin Benson and Arthur Lowe set up a theatre in Alexandria to entertain the troops.
He was very laid back, very restrained, a very quiet man. And sometimes you didn't even know he was there. And I thought, gosh, am I going to be saddled with this fellow? But I think that perhaps he went out of his way to be matey with me because I was his superior officer after all. I mean, he was only a sergeant and I was a captain at that stage.
As an actor, Arthur Lowe was no overnight sensation.
His performances were always competent, but they never seemed to have the vital spark. He was no Richard Burton.
Richard Burton or not, by the time he was demobbed, Arthur Lowe had decided on an acting career.
Arthur set himself a goal to succeed within a period, perhaps 5 years or so. I think had he not succeeded, he would have returned to the north to go and work in the factory and tried to pick up his life there.
He successfully auditioned with the Manchester Repertory Company and in January 1946 began his professional career in the wartime romance Flare Path. It was during rehearsals for the play that he met Joan Cooper.
She was upstairs and the tannoy was on in the dressing room and Arthur was doing his audition downstairs and she said to this girl that was with her, "Who's that man with the most gorgeous voice?" He said. "I think I'm going to marry him." And she did.
From the start, Arthur and Joan were an unlikely couple. She was blonde and bubbly, at 22 a leading actress. New boy Arthur was 30, short and bald, and prematurely old. And his early performances hadn't impressed the theatre management.
They thought his performances were too small, and they were going to sack him, surprisingly. And she said, "Oh, no, 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 this is the best actor we've ever had in the company." And she took him by the hand, and, well, the rest is history, really.
Arthur was deeply conventional and straight-laced. Yet he was drawn into a risque affair with Joan. They had to meet in secret because Joan was already married to another actor, Richard Gatehouse, and they had a 5-year-old son.
Arthur's very different in style from Richie, my father. I don't know what the main attraction would be, because Arthur wouldn't ever have claimed to be dapper or debonair or in any way madly exciting. I think one thing just was very definitely sure, and that was that they were very much in love.
Richard Gatehouse didn't realise his young wife was falling in love with another actor.
Joan and Arthur and I met quite frequently. We were great friends. He was a perfectly respectable-looking actor. He didn't look like Captain Mainwaring then.
Arthur's diary records his and Joan's secret liaisons during the first 6 months of 1946. Finally, Arthur wrote to Richard, confessing the affair, and Richard agreed to a divorce. It turned out he'd been having an affair with 19-year-old actress Barbara Bliss.
Oh, what with one thing and another. Joan and Arthur came together, Barbara and I came together. It was all very amicable. All of us being actors, I suppose that's the reason. Magic word theatre.
But Richard and Joan couldn't divorce as easily as that.
They had to be, as it were, caught in bed together. I spoke to this waiter, and he said, "Oh, yes, I'll take them morning tea in bed." And I gave him £5. And he then came to court and gave evidence that he had brought them tea, and there they were, both in bed together.
It's highly theatrical, it's farce, isn't it? And it's just lucky that Arthur didn't jump out of bed and hide in the wardrobe at that moment or something. Yeah.
And here we are. Joan got her divorce in November 1947, and soon after she and Arthur married. No friends, relatives or photographers were invited to the ceremony. Appropriately, as this personal farce played out, Arthur and Joan were appearing together in Almost a Honeymoon. Rep was a hard training ground. Every week, Arthur and Joan performed one play while learning and rehearsing another for the following week.
Weekly rep could be hell on earth, but there was a wonderful feeling of comradeship. Arthur and I both had this in common, and we used to chat and say, "Oh, Durham, did you do such and such a play? What part did you play? Did you 10-minute alibi? Oh, yes, I played the detective. I played the censor. Oh, the magic cupboard. Oh, yes." And we'd quote from it. But it was everybody's dream to get away from it, somehow get a part in a film or whatever.
Arthur and Joan dreamt of West End success, and at the end of 1947, they moved to London to try and get their breakthrough. But Joan's career stalled. She'd been a leading lady, but now all she could get was occasional work as a stage manager. She gave up altogether when Stephen was born. Arthur had to fend for them all.
He would spend hours every morning, unless, of course, there was a job to go off to, which there usually wasn't, every morning ringing round what seemed to me to be everybody connected with the theatre in London, simply saying, "Good morning, how are you? Yes, I know I spoke to you yesterday, but I just wondered if there was anything for me." And every now and then there was.
Arthur could only find work in suburban rep. A week in Bromley, a week in Penge, perhaps a fortnight in Croydon.
I'm pretty certain that that determination wasn't driven just by an aspiration to become a successful actor or any feelings of art. It was money, for God's sake.
They like Ike, and Ike is good on a mic, and they know.
After 6 years of struggle, Arthur finally made his West End debut in 1952 with Irving Berlin's Call Me Madam. It was his ability to sing in an American accent that got him the part.
For nearly 20 years, we've had the people's cheers. The Democrats continue to advance. Of course they could have raised...
It was huge excitement. I mean, they knew that these American musicals, if successful, ran for, well, more than a week. Although in the end, I think it ran longer than they had ever imagined. I think that was the first time they could afford a bottle of wine with a meal at the weekend.
The 50s were a happy time for Arthur and Joan. He did a string of American musicals like Pal Joey and The Pajama Game. She basked in the reflected limelight, going to the opening night parties and enjoying the buzz of London theatre life. If any gaps appeared in his diary, Arthur would fill them with small parts in feature films or radio broadcasts, or the occasional TV role.
Now, who will that be? Stay we are, I'll go. Oh, hello, Mr. Swindley. I didn't know there was anybody left in the hall. I thought the committee all have gone by now.
Good evening, Mrs. Shovels.
When Coronation Street began in 1960, Arthur was only asked to do 3 episodes.
Now, what can I do for you? And if it's about those broken pots last Thursday, don't look at me. It was that Mrs. Barron of the Woman's Happy Afternoon.
No, I've not come about that. I've come on another errand, although naturally the question of the...
But before long, he'd become a fixture in the street.
The Women's Happy Afternoon say they know nothing about these breakages.
Oh?
Look, I think I'd better come back tomorrow when there's nobody here.
When Arthur came into the street, he was one of those actors I used to love being in the scene with, or I used to watch, because you don't do this very often, because he used to play this not remembering people's names and all this vagueness, but it was very precise, and his comedy timing was quite brilliant.
Do you want me, Mr. Swindley?
No, we're having mock fire precautions at 12:30, you know.
Oh, I see. Tra.
Goodbye, Miss Barlow.
Mrs.
Tetlock. Ready, steady. Fire.
Leonard Swindley quickly became a household name. But for Arthur, this sudden success proved a mixed blessing.
Now, student. No panic.
Arthur did not like the celebrity trappings at all. Fame, or whatever you want to call it, he did not enjoy. He was a very private man, and to him it was a total invasion of privacy.
There you are. Dead easy.
There was a lot of baggage attached to Swindley for Arthur, because it was the first time he tasted fame. People would walk up to him in the street and stop him and, "Oh, you're Arthur Lowe, aren't you?" And, or "You're Swindley," they'd say, which was worse, you see. They wouldn't recognise him as Arthur Lowe. We were riding round Hyde Park Corner on horseback, and a cabbie pulled down his window, leant out and said, "God blimey, it's Swindley on an horse."
Joan didn't like Swindley either. She thought Coronation Street was a waste of a carefully nurtured talent.
There was more in it for Joan, frankly, for him to be well known on the London stage, more parties to go to, more people to talk to, more interest for her generally, and she able to go along to first nights and things like that, than him working in a comparatively bland television studio in Manchester. It became a source of considerable tension between them. And then it would explode.
They were apart during the week. Arthur stayed in digs in Manchester and Joan remained in London.
Joan became intensely lonely at that time. After she'd put me to bed, she'd spend the evenings buffing the floor with a hand floor buffer, really getting it so shiny, quite unnecessarily shiny, and I think it was just it was just a manifestation of her frustration and her loneliness. I think it's probably while Arthur was playing in Manchester that my mother found a certain amount of comfort from drinking him, probably at that time, half a bottle of sherry or something like that.
This weekly separation lasted for 7 years. After 4 years, Arthur left Coronation Street, but he stayed in Manchester.
It's purely a matter of reflexes, coordination, timing, and confidence.
Yes.
Right?
A new weekly series, pardon the expression, was created around Swindley.
I just found him a very odd character. He never smiled, and I can't get together with people that don't ever smile. And he was so he liked to upstage you all the time and just take over and think. It's very odd that maybe he had troubles at home or some terrible worries or something, but he was a very, very quiet, remote man when he worked with us.
Will you show me your modus operandi?
Me what?
Your method of defence.
Rather selfish actor, and sounds rotten of me to say that, but I'm speaking the truth. But it was strange, he didn't stay around with anyone. He'd just do his lines, and then he'd disappear and be gone.
Very well.
Right, you ready?
Ready.
Pardon the expression was a huge success, but the pressures of unwanted celebrity and an increasingly difficult home life took its toll on Arthur, and he slipped into depression.
I suppose Arthur's depression lasted something between 2 and 5 years at the end of the Swindley time. I'm guessing I'd be sort of 11 or 12 at this time, and that he just wouldn't be any fun, you know, because he could be great fun at home, but he would go through periods of seeking seclusion, and one would quite often see him in private moments looking quite down. Eventually the doctor said that what he really needed probably to take was quite substantial holidays. So we went on the Bravo down to Italy, to the Mediterranean. That was a month away.
Arthur shot this home movie of the Lowe family holiday.
And these were very happy times, because this was us together as a family, which was something we very rarely were. She had him to herself, which was what she wanted, and he just blossomed really on these holidays. You saw all the weight fall off his shoulders, and he became relaxed and cheerful. But those are times that I really remember with great happiness.
Now Stephen was growing up, Joan decided she wanted to return to the stage. It was 20 years since she'd worked with Arthur, and she desperately wanted to recapture those happier times.
Well, it was a bit of a problem for me, quite honestly, because I would say Joan's acting was very much old school, actually. It was sort of speak up and project and be heard at the back of the gallery. Their talents were not equal, really, and I still to this day don't know, really, whether he really knew it. I think he must have done, though, really. He was too good himself not to have done, you know. But then love is blind, they say.
When Arthur was asked to do Lock Up Your Daughters, he asked Peter Campbell to get a part for Joan.
Without being too unkind to her, you know, they wanted Arthur, obviously, but Joan was part of the package, you know, and that, I think, was quite damaging to him, really, it really was, yeah.
Joan was in danger of crippling Arthur's stage career. But his stage career was about to have to go on hold anyway. It was 1968, and Arthur had been offered a part in a new BBC sitcom.
For you, sir. This is the moment I've been waiting for.
Arthur wasn't the first choice to play Captain Mainwaring. 2 actors had already refused the part.
Asking for instructions in case of an invasion. I told them that I held a commission and that I'd served in the last conflict.
Somewhere in the Orkneys, wasn't it, sir?
I was a commissioned officer, Wilson, and I served in France. during the whole of 1919.
Yes, but war ended in 1918, I thought, sir.
Well, somebody had to clear up the mess.
Oh, yes, of course.
Where were you during the war?
Mons, Gallipoli, Passchendaele. I was a sergeant in the RS.
But Dad's Army co-writer, Jimmy Perry, had always been keen on Arthur.
Michael Mills, head of light entertainment, because in those days they were all lieutenant commanders or ex-colonels or ex-squadron leaders. The jobs in the BBC, which is no worse than it's ever been. And he'd say, Michael Mills, we don't know Arthur Lowe. He works up north, that thing, what is it, Coronation Street. Oh, no, he never works for us. They were that peculiar, terribly snobbish, the BBC in those days.
See, it doesn't happen again.
Eventually, the BBC agreed to let Arthur play the role.
Where did you get that gun? Eh? The gun, where did you get it?
Well, it belongs to my friend, actually.
I see. He's got a friend. A gun.
Yes, I can see
We
that.
gradually watched Arthur,
I'm the officer.
Yes, sir, quite.
You're the sergeant.
Quite, yes, sir.
We ought to have that. Yeah.
and we realised that his personality was amazing.
No.
We wrote a lot of his personal sort of idiosyncrasies into the script. So we gradually started to write for Arthur personally. Don't worry about any acting. I don't believe in acting, actually.
There's nothing coming through.
So as time went by,
Let me see. There's probably some obstruction in the pipe.
Captain Mainwaring became Arthur Lowe, and Arthur Lowe became Captain Mainwaring.
Let's go and help. There's no sign of any foreign body there. Turn the valve on, Fraser.
What are you doing, maniac?
Every year, the Dad's Army cast and crew travelled up to Norfolk for 4 weeks of location filming. Even when they weren't filming, Arthur would often play at being Mainwaring.
Breakfast at the hotel is another game altogether. And she said, well, Arthur, we've got about a quarter of an hour now before the assistant producer will be round, to get us on the coach, and never mind about all that. Where's the waiter? And the waiter, he said, waiter, I want ham this morning, some nice ham. Off the bone, of course, off the bone. This off the bone became a thing, If we haven't got it off the bone, I have kippers, and I want a proper kipper, the head and the tail. Those plastic things, all this going on. It was ludicrous. But when it got in front of the camera, of course, all that eccentricity came through.
You're a good man, Captain Napoleon. You can't help being pompous.
Thank you very
Arthur had hated being confused with Leonard Swindley, but he was happy to blur the line between himself and Mainwaring.
Are you anything like the character you play in Dad's Army, Captain Mainwaring?
Oh, no. No, certainly not. I've always been asked this question, and the answer's definitely no. Captain Mainwaring's a very pompous man, Nothing pompous about me.
That's very interesting, Arthur.
Please, do you mind, Mr. Lowe?
Obviously, a certain amount of Arthur coming through into the character, but it seemed to me completely different. The character of Mainwaring made a decision whether it was right or wrong, and most of the times it was wrong, whereas Arthur didn't make decisions very easily at all. In private life, he was never quite in charge. I think Joan sorted things out quite a lot for him.
Dad's Army producer, David Croft, encouraged wives and families to join the cast and crew on location. For Joan, the whole spirit of Dad's Army was reminiscent of her early days with Arthur in the happy family of Rep.
All right, Fraser, I can look after myself.
Don't you start anything. Just clear off, will you?
But Joan could only look in from the outside, and around this time, friends began to notice she was inclined to drink too much.
As I say, she was ever such a sweet drunk. She wasn't horrid in any manner of way. She used to just totter away and talking to herself, bang into the wall. She was sweet.
Always, by the end of the evening, bless her heart, Joan was well gone, which he handled beautifully. He'd sort of say, oh, mother's had too much tonight, hasn't she? Ha, 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 and she was taken off to bed. But I think sometimes it was quite an embarrassment to him. I think he was very worried about leaving her on her own at times because of this.
Right, so yes. Keep yours short.
Yes, I will, yes.
Don't get drunk. What?
So Arthur approached Jimmy Perry about a role for Joan, and he discussed it with David Croft. She got a few walk-on parts, then a more regular role as Private Godfrey's sister Dolly.
Charles nearly got married once, didn't you, Charles?
I wanted to.
It would never have done. Her parents lived in a bungalow.
She wasn't a bad actress. The sort of parts we gave her were fine. Anybody, I don't want to be disparaging, but anybody could have played them that was a competent actress. So we used her when we could.
Married a farmer. I see her from time to time.
Do you?
She's a widow now.
Is she?
Have another one, Miss Godfrey.
I don't know whether I should say this, but in the business, you have to say your lines and walk. Or walk and say your lines. Well, she couldn't do that. She had to say her lines and then walk. She couldn't do the two together. She couldn't coordinate.
It's very caddish to talk about Mr. Mainwaring's wife like this. I'm sure she's a very charming lady.
It's ironic that Joan should appear in Dad's Army, yet Captain Mainwaring's wife was never ever seen.
With his wife in the bedroom.
Oh, it's one of those sort of parties, is it?
How dare you come bursting in onto...
Just as Joan was central to Arthur, Elizabeth was a brooding, offstage presence in Mainwaring's life.
Oh, she's on the way. Hodges, what are you doing here?
Yeah. You were shown a light upstairs.
My wife inadvertently stumbled against the blackout curtain.
Aye, she's been at the bismuth again, has she?
Come along, dear. They're dying to see you.
David and I thought he's got to have some sad bit in his life.
Say hello before you go.
David and Arthur and I discussed it. I said, she's fat. She's nasty. She breaks wind when you're in bed with her, Arthur. He said, yes, I quite see that. And I want you to feel that when you're talking about her. Hello, Elizabeth.
Marriage falls asunder quite easily anyway, doesn't it?
Oh, no. Not in my case. I've had a very happy marriage. Very happy indeed. That's all.
The only member of the Lowe family who didn't enjoy Dad's Army was Stephen.
When I was a boy at school, Mainwaring was an embarrassment to me. It's not hard to be cast as Pike once they know that your father is Mainwaring.
You stupid boy.
Oh, stupid boy.
You stupid boy.
Even now, sometimes jokes about Mainwaring can be irksome. However, I love the programme, and so it's a mixture of great pride and also this sort of faint, irked embarrassment, because it changes your life, you know, and it does, and you can't avoid it. It changes your life.
It's difficult now to think of Arthur Lowe in any other role than Captain Mainwaring, but he was always regarded for his straight acting. Director Lindsay Anderson cast him in 4 films, including This Sporting Life.
Oh, still, false teeth can be better looking than the real thing sometimes. What do you think mine are?
They look very neat.
Are they false or real?
False, but they could be real.
The false. I wish you a Merry Christmas.
Arthur was a much better actor than people thought, because he was, I mean, most people only know him as Mainwaring, or perhaps in Coronation Street, some people. But I mean, some of the other characters he played were superb. I mean, that was really high-class acting.
In the early 70s, Arthur was at his peak. He played Shakespeare at the Old Vic and won awards and nominations for characters as diverse as Mainwaring in Dad's Army and Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield.
Yes, Micawber. But
As to that, my dear, I give you a toast.
He was never precious about his talent or about the quality of work on offer. He always kept busy and rarely turned down any opportunity. however cheesy.
And if you should ask me if dreams do come true, when I'm with you, oh yes, they do. For who fills my whole life with sunshine and a joy? My little girl, my little boy.
But in 1974, at the height of his fame, Arthur Lowe showed symptoms of a strange and troubling problem. He kept suddenly falling asleep.
We just thought he fell asleep because he ate too much. Now, Arthur ate for England. He loved his food. It got worse and worse. And then when we were shooting in the studio, okay, all right, we're going for the scene now, turn over and all that rubbish. And then he'd start the scene. Now, look here. And he'd fall asleep. And he'd say, you all right, Arthur? Yes, why? What's wrong?
Bill Pertwee, who worked with Arthur on stage as well as in Dad's Army, witnessed many examples of this sleepiness.
The dresser came down to me in my dressing room and said, Mr. Lowe's all changed, ready to go on. He said it was singlet and shorts he had, and plimsolls, and he had to make his entrance down the stairs. That was his first entrance. But I can't wake him, he's sound asleep. I said, oh, he's gone off again. I said, Arthur, it's 10 minutes to go, wake up. You know, nothing. I said, go and get Mrs. Lowe to the dresser. So she came down and said, Arthur, wake up, Arthur. So she get him up. So we got him up to open the window, and she took the soda siphon and squirted on the back of his neck. And the reaction from Arthur was, well, is it raining?
The play was called Caught Napping. Arthur's sleepiness was eventually diagnosed as narcolepsy, an incurable disorder.
It was very, very distressing for him. I mean, for instance, it also very often he slurred his words, and it gave the impression he was drunk, quite honestly. And once or twice in restaurants, he would almost fall into the soup, nodding off, and people assumed he'd had too much to drink. It was a big, big problem for him.
Whether it was to keep Arthur awake, or to keep Joan happy, or whether it was simply to relive their early days in rep, the Lowes increasingly insisted on working together. When Dad's Army came to an end in 1977, Peter Campbell was able to get them parts in J.B. Priestley's Laburnum Grove. The play was to tour and then come into London.
I wasn't able to go up for the first night at Harrogate, but the following morning I got a phone call from Duncan Weldon saying, look, we have a problem. I said, what would that be? He said, we definitely want to bring it in to London, but it can't come in with Joan. I'm afraid the performance is inadequate. So I said, well, really, Duncan, if it can't come in with Joan, you've got to forget the whole thing, because there's no way that Arthur would come into town with the play unless she was to be included. So eventually he had to relent.
Soon after, Peter found a part in another play for Arthur, but there was no role for Joan.
The telephone rang and it was Arthur. He sounded very distressed. And he came into the office and he was almost in tears, actually. And he said, Peter, don't please ever put me in that position again. He said, I've had the worst weekend of my life. There's no way that I can do this play. This is when he said, please, anything to do with theatre whatsoever, don't even tell me about it unless it can include Joan.
Arthur never appeared in the West End again. In the last 5 years of his life, he turned down role after role, including a part in Warren Beatty's movie Heaven Can Wait. He could have followed many British character actors and gone to Hollywood. His autumn years were spent doing indifferent TV and touring provincial theatres with Joan. They often chose venues where they could moor Amazon, a huge steam yacht they'd salvaged and lovingly restored. At Eastbourne and the Isle of Wight, they played in Beyond a Joke. The part of Arthur's mother was changed to his sister so that Joan could play it. At Christmas 1981, for the first and only time, Arthur played Panto. He wasn't keen on doing Mother Goose, but agreed when a part, the Queen of Gooseland, was written for Joan.
It was a very sad and very difficult time for him. He did too much, frankly. I think towards the end he was really quite unwell, and nobody quite realised quite how unwell he was. But again, he was doing it, I think, for Joan.
A month before he died, Arthur presented a BAFTA award to his old friend, Dad's Army producer, David Croft.
All right, settle down, everyone. He wrote books and I'll say that again.
The audience, full of friends and colleagues, thought his muddle and confusion was an act.
He wrote books and lyrics for pantomime, as well as production numbers with Cyril Ornadell.
And he rang me the next day and said, "Oh, I made a right potch of that last night."
Became a trainee television. It says trainee television here, but I think.
But he turned it very much, being the professional he was, his own advantage, in fact, and made an asset of a problem. But I think he was quite scared by that actually happening, you know?
I'm sure I'd read this before I came.
Arthur's last performance was in the provincial tour of Home at 7. It's an old-fashioned murder mystery. Arthur played a man losing his memory, and Joan played his concerned wife.
I was quite surprised that he did want to do it, because, I mean, at that age, a long tour is fairly arduous. But they did want to do it, and I did ask him why, and he said because he loved the play. So, you know, he could make his choices.
It was the best part Joan had had since her early days in Rep, but it was an exhausting role for Arthur in his state of health.
He was finding it just a little more difficult. For instance, on the first night, the theatre manager said to me, "Arthur's asleep." And I looked, and yes, sure, he sort of nodded off. But I said to him, "But don't worry, he'll wake up dead on cue." And indeed, Joan moved herself closer and closer and closer to Arthur, and she just brought her voice up to such a pitch that obviously it got through into Arthur's sleep. He woke up, the question came, and he answered it as though he'd been absolutely alert and never been asleep at all.
On the day he collapsed, Arthur was busy in Birmingham promoting Home at 7. He did 2 radio interviews and then Pebble Mill at 1.
What do you like about acting with the wife on stage? Don't destroy the microphone, Spo.
I like it because it means that we get a lot of nice paid holidays. We did a nice season in Eastbourne last year, so that's nice. I'll smash this one, sorry.
You're getting tangled up. While you sort yourself out, Arthur, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
After the interview, Arthur went straight to the theatre for the matinee performance. Shortly after 6, company manager Roger Richardson was called urgently to Arthur's dressing room.
I found that he'd collapsed, and I rolled him over because he was lying sort of face down, and he sort of just, the words he came out with were, oh my God, oh help me, my God, and that was it, and he just sort of went into unconsciousness after that. I got Arthur into the ambulance, and then I took a deep breath and had to go and tell Joan. And she said to me, "He'll be absolutely furious with you when he wakes up. He's done this to me before. He'll be absolutely furious with you, Roger. Oh, if he wakes up in hospital, you know, my life wouldn't be worth living, basically." But I knew it was much much more serious than that. And I asked if she wants to go to the hospital, and, well, no, we've got a show to do. Arthur will be back before the show.
Arthur never came back. His penultimate film role had been strangely prophetic.
Palace, Sir Hubert.
They wouldn't listen to me. You wouldn't listen to me. This sceptred isle, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this precious stone set in a silver sea, this blessed plot, this realm, this England.
He's gone.
Pity. He'd have appreciated a visit.
Arthur never recovered from the stroke he'd suffered and died in the small hours of the morning, alone in hospital.
Because she lived theatre all her life, Joan was determined on one thing only, and that is that she would go on for the next performance. I rather imagine I was there watching her, but it was all awful, and I don't really remember that. But she certainly went on and did the show. I think she went on with the tour.
She insisted on remaining with the company. She played that night and continued the rest of the tour. In fact, the following week, for the funeral, she was in fact in Belfast, and she wasn't at the funeral.
On Joan's instructions, Arthur was quietly cremated in Birmingham. Only a handful of people attended, and his ashes were scattered in the crematorium garden.
She always said that Arthur had said if anything happened to him, she was to go on working and not take the time off. So I don't know. Maybe it was they had something between them. I don't know. But it was very sad because none of us could sort of actually say goodbye to him.
Because her life had been entirely given to Arthur for so many years, it was the most terrible blow for her. And it was a way for her to postpone the time when she really had to come to terms with that death. And in fact, it was much later and much more privately that Joan went to pieces.
After Arthur's death, Joan's work dried up. In 1987, she left London for Arthur's family home, Hayfield. Alone and unhappy, she spent most of her time drinking. She died 2 years later. Arthur Lowe never quite reached the heights. Ironically, it was his love for Joan, his greatest admirer and advocate, that held him back.
His home life and his family life and his life with Joan were the most important thing to him, and acting was his work. And perhaps in the final outcome, not much more than that to him, his work.
Mock the Week is next here on BBC Two, then Comedy Connections on another classic Brit comedy, The Liverbirds, at 11:25.